The shot rang out behind her, shattering the winter silence as Theresa Donovan ran through the knee-deep snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her lungs with every desperate inhale. The three men had been following her since she left the general store in Silverton, Colorado, their voices growing bolder as the December afternoon faded into early dusk, and the wind picked up, swirling fresh powder across the narrow street. She had tried to lose them by ducking behind the livery stable, but they anticipated her move, spreading out to cut off her escape routes until she found herself trapped in the narrow alley between two weathered buildings, their forms blocking the only way back to the main street where help might be found. "Nowhere to run now, pretty lady," the tallest one said, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air as he advanced, his companions flanking him on either side. His eyes held a cruel glint that made her stomach twist with fear. She pressed her back against the rough wooden wall, feeling the cold seep through her heavy wool coat as she clutched her small bag of supplies against her chest like a shield. The snow continued to fall in thick flakes, obscuring the buildings beyond the alley, and muffling the sounds of the town that seemed so impossibly far away, despite being just yards distant. Before the man could take another step, a figure appeared behind them, moving with the swift confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Strong fingers wrapped around her wrist, and she barely had time to register the warmth of human contact before she was being pulled with surprising gentleness but undeniable urgency past the startled men and into the swirling snow. Her rescuer moved with practiced efficiency, his boots finding purchase where she would have stumbled, his grip firm but careful as he navigated the treacherous footing with the ease of someone who had spent his entire life in mountain country. "Come on," he said, his voice low and steady despite the speed at which they moved. "My horse is just ahead." Theresa stumbled once, her skirts heavy with accumulated snow, but the stranger's hand tightened supportively around her wrist and kept her upright as they rounded the corner of the assayer's office. Behind them, she heard angry shouts and the sound of boots pounding through the snow, but her rescuer seemed to know every turn and shortcut in Silverton's maze of buildings and equipment sheds. A magnificent bay stallion stood tethered to a post outside the boarding house, his dark coat flecked with snowflakes that melted against his warmth. The stranger released her wrist only long enough to untie the reins with swift, practiced movements. Then he was lifting her into the saddle with strength that suggested he was accustomed to harder labor than merely riding. He swung up behind her in a single fluid motion, his arm coming around her waist as he gathered the reins and urged the horse into motion with a soft click of his tongue that the animal seemed to understand perfectly. They rode hard through the snow-covered streets, past surprised miners and shopkeepers who barely had time to step aside as the bay thundered past. The stranger guided the horse with expert precision, avoiding the worst of the ice patches and frozen ruts that could have sent them all sprawling. Theresa could feel the solid warmth of him behind her, could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the controlled strength in the arm that held her secure against the jolting gait. The three men's shouts faded behind them as they left the town proper and headed into the surrounding hills where pine trees stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with accumulated snow. Only when they had ridden for what felt like miles did the stranger slow their pace, guiding the horse into a small clearing where a cabin stood nestled among the evergreens, smoke rising from its stone chimney in a thin gray line that promised warmth and shelter. The windows glowed with lamplight that looked impossibly welcoming after the cold terror of the past hour. He dismounted first, then reached up to help her down, his hands settling on her waist with a care that suggested he was very conscious of the fear she must still be feeling. "You are safe now," he said, and for the first time she got a proper look at him in the fading light. He was perhaps 25, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath the brim of his hat, and eyes the color of warm honey that regarded her with genuine concern. His features were weathered by sun and wind, the face of a man who spent his days outdoors, but there was a kindness in his expression that made something tight in her chest begin to loosen. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, his coat worn but well maintained, his boots showing the scuffs and repairs of long use. "Thank you," Theresa managed, her voice shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to fade and left her trembling in its wake. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not come along when you did." The admission made her feel vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, and she wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly very aware of how isolated they were out here in the wilderness. "Let me get you inside where it is warm," he said, already leading his horse toward a small lean-to stable attached to the cabin. "You can wait by the fire while I tend to Sterling here, and then we will figure out what to do next." He spoke with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations, and despite everything that had just happened, Theresa found herself trusting him in a way that would have surprised her an hour ago. The cabin's interior was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace crackling merrily and casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn wooden walls. A narrow bed stood in one corner, neatly made with what looked like hand-stitched quilts. A small table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and shelves lined one wall holding supplies and a few battered books. It was clearly the home of a man who lived alone, but took pride in maintaining some measure of order in his life. Theresa moved gratefully toward the fire, holding her frozen hands out to the warmth as feeling began to return to her fingers in painful tingles. The stranger returned a few minutes later, stomping snow from his boots before entering and removing his hat to hang on a peg by the door. His dark hair was slightly damp from the snow, and in the firelight she could see that he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps closer to her own age of 22. He moved to the stove and began preparing coffee with the efficient movements of long practice, measuring grounds and water without seeming to think about what he was doing. "My name is Wade Emmett," he said as he worked. "I run cattle in these mountains during the warmer months, but winter I mostly keep to myself up here and do some trapping." He glanced at her over his shoulder, his expression open and honest. "Those men back in town, did they hurt you?" "No," Theresa said quickly, grateful that she could give him that reassurance. "They were following me, saying things that made me uncomfortable, but you arrived before they could do more than corner me." She paused, then added, "I am Theresa Donovan. I came to Silverton 3 months ago to work as a teacher. The mining families here needed someone to educate their children, and the position seemed like an opportunity for a fresh start." Wade nodded, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups and bringing one to her. Their fingers brushed as she accepted it, and she was struck again by the gentleness in his touch, so at odds with the strength she had felt when he pulled her into that saddle. "A teacher," he said thoughtfully. "That is good work, important work. These mountain children need all the education they can get if they are going to have opportunities, beyond breaking their backs in the mines like their fathers." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, sipping the strong hot coffee that sent warmth spreading through Theresa's chest and helped chase away the last of the cold fear. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and sending snow skittering against the windows in soft whispers. She realized with a start that the storm was worsening, and the sky visible through the small window had darkened to the deep purple-gray of heavy snowfall. "I should get back to town," she said reluctantly, though the thought of going back out into the storm made her want to stay right where she was. "My landlady will worry if I do not return before full dark." Wade moved to the window and looked out, his expression growing serious. "That storm is turning into a proper blizzard," he said quietly. "It would not be safe to ride back now, not in the dark with visibility this poor. The trail is dangerous enough in good weather." He turned back to her, and she could see the conflict in his eyes, the awareness that his suggestion might make her uncomfortable. "You are welcome to stay here tonight. I will sleep in the stable with Sterling, and you can have the cabin to yourself. Come morning, when the storm has passed, I will take you back to town." The offer was made with such straightforward decency that Theresa felt her initial hesitation fade. She had heard stories of men who might use such a situation to take advantage, but everything about Wade Emmett suggested he was not that kind of man. Still, she knew what people in town might say if they learned she had spent the night alone with a bachelor in his cabin, regardless of the circumstances. "I do not want to put you out of your own bed," she said carefully. "And I worry about what people might think if they knew I was here unchaperoned." "Those men who were following you," Wade said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "they are the Garrett brothers. They work for one of the bigger mining operations, and they have a reputation for causing trouble. If they saw which direction we rode, they might come looking once the storm passes." He crossed his arms, his expression determined. "I would feel better knowing you are safe and warm in here rather than risking the ride back to town, regardless of what the gossips might say. Your safety matters more than their idle talk." Theresa felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through her chest at his words. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her with such protective concern, not since her father had died 2 years ago and left her to make her own way in the world. "Thank you," she said softly. "I accept your offer, but please, you should not sleep in the stable. It is too cold out there, and you have already done so much for me. I trust you to be a gentleman." Something shifted in Wade's expression, a softening around his eyes that made him look even younger and somehow more vulnerable. "I give you my word that you are safe with me," he said seriously. "But I will take the floor by the fire. You take the bed, and we will leave the lamp burning if that makes you feel more comfortable." As the evening deepened and the storm raged outside, they fell into an easy conversation that surprised them both. Wade prepared a simple supper of salt pork, beans, and cornbread that tasted better than it had any right to. Perhaps because Theresa was so hungry, or perhaps because there was something comforting about sharing a meal with someone who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being. They talked about their lives, their pasts, the dreams they had carried with them to this rough mountain town. Theresa told him about growing up in Kansas, about her father who had been a schoolteacher himself and had instilled in her a love of learning and a belief in the power of education to change lives. She spoke of how his death from pneumonia had left her alone and struggling, how the teaching position in Silverton had seemed like a chance to build a new life in a place where no one knew her as the poor orphan girl who had to sell her father's house to pay his medical debts. Wade listened with an attention that made her feel truly heard, his eyes never leaving her face as she spoke. When she finished, he shared his own story, his voice taking on a distant quality as he remembered. He had grown up on a ranch in Wyoming, the youngest of 4 brothers. His family had been close, but the ranch could not support them all, so when he turned 18 he had struck out on his own, working his way south through various cattle operations, until he saved enough to buy his own small herd and claim this piece of mountain land. "It is not much," he admitted, gesturing around the simple cabin, "but it is mine. No one can take it from me or tell me to move on. In the summer the cattle graze in the high meadows and the wildflowers grow so thick you can hardly see the ground. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." His voice held a note of wonder that suggested he still could not quite believe his good fortune, and Theresa found herself wanting to see those meadows through his eyes, to understand what made this hard, lonely life worth living. "It sounds wonderful," she said honestly. "Isolated, but peaceful. I can understand the appeal of building something that is entirely your own." "It can be lonely," Wade admitted, meeting her eyes across the small table. "Especially in winter when the snow cuts me off from town for days or weeks at a time. But I always told myself it was worth it, that the freedom was worth the solitude." He paused, then added so quietly she almost missed it. "Tonight, though, having company, having someone to talk to, I am remembering what I have been missing." The honesty in his words made Theresa's breath catch. She recognized the loneliness he described because she felt it herself, the isolation of being an outsider in a town where everyone else seemed to have their established connections and histories. The other teachers she had met were all married women who viewed her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, and the unmarried men in town had mostly proven to be like the Garrett brothers, seeing her as either a curiosity or a potential conquest rather than a person worthy of respect. "I know what you mean," she said softly. "I have felt more alone in a crowded schoolroom than I ever did living by myself after my father died. At least then, I knew the solitude was circumstantial. In Silverton, surrounded by people, it feels more like a fundamental isolation that no amount of company can fix." "Until tonight," Wade said, and the words hung between them like a promise neither quite dared to acknowledge yet. They talked late into the evening, the conversation flowing easily from topic to topic, as if they had known each other for years rather than hours. Theresa found herself laughing at Wade's stories about his misadventures learning to be a cattleman, and she felt her cheeks warm when he asked her to tell him about her favorite books, listening with genuine interest as she described the poetry and novels that had sustained her through difficult times. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin felt like a sanctuary removed from time and space, a place where two lonely people had found unexpected connection. Finally, as the hour grew late and Theresa could not suppress her yawns any longer, Wade insisted she take the bed while he arranged blankets by the fire. She changed into one of his clean shirts for sleeping, the fabric hanging nearly to her knees and carrying the faint scent of sage and wood smoke that she was beginning to associate with him. When she emerged from behind the privacy blanket he had strung across one corner, she found he had already settled by the fire, his back courteously turned to give her privacy. "Good night, Wade," she said softly, climbing into the narrow bed that still held warmth from the heated stones he had placed beneath the quilts. "Thank you again for everything you have done for me today." He turned his head just enough that she could see his profile in the firelight. "Sleep well, Theresa," he said. "You are safe here, I promise." And strangely, wonderfully, she believed him. Despite everything that had happened, despite the fear and the storm and the complete disruption of her normal life, Theresa felt safer in this stranger's cabin than she had felt anywhere since her father died. She drifted off to sleep with the sound of the wind outside and the gentle crackling of the fire, and for the first time in months, her dreams were peaceful. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, weak winter sunlight streaming through the windows to illuminate a world transformed by snow. Wade was at the stove, his back to her, as he cooked breakfast with the same efficient competence he brought to everything else. Theresa took a moment to simply watch him, noticing the way his hair curled at his collar, the breadth of his shoulders beneath his worn shirt, the careful way he moved to avoid making too much noise and waking her. Something warm and unfamiliar stirred in her chest, and she recognized it with a start as the first flutter of attraction, of genuine interest in a man that went beyond mere gratitude. "Good morning," she said, sitting up and pushing her hair back from her face, suddenly self-conscious about how she must look after sleeping in his shirt with her hair loose around her shoulders. Wade turned, a smile lighting his face that made him look younger and impossibly handsome. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I hope you slept well. The storm passed about an hour ago and the day looks clear. We can head back to town after breakfast if you are ready." Part of her did not want to go back, wanted to stay in this warm cabin where she felt understood and valued in ways she had not experienced in far too long. But she knew they could not hide from the world forever, and she had responsibilities waiting for her in Silverton. Children who needed teaching, a job she could not afford to lose, a life she had worked hard to build even if it was sometimes lonely. They ate breakfast together, making plans for the ride back. Wade insisted on taking a roundabout route that would bring them into town from the north rather than directly from his cabin, a consideration for her reputation that touched her deeply. He also made her promise that if she saw the Garrett brothers again, she would go immediately to the sheriff and tell him what had happened. "Tom Fletcher is a good man," Wade assured her. "He will make sure those three leave you alone. They have been trouble before, and he has been looking for a reason to run them out of town." The ride back to Silverton was beautiful in the clear morning light, with snow sparkling like diamonds and the sky a brilliant blue overhead. Wade kept the pace easy, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the country they passed through with the affection of someone who truly loved this land. Theresa found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride, acutely aware of his presence behind her in the saddle, the way his arm stayed protectively around her waist even though the horse's gait was gentle, and she was in no danger of falling. When they reached the edge of town, Wade reined in Sterling and helped Theresa down with obvious reluctance. "I do not come to town often," he said, looking down at her with an expression she could not quite read. "But I would like to see you again if you would allow it. Maybe I could call on you properly, take you to dinner at the hotel when I come in for supplies next week." Theresa felt her heart lift at the question, at the tentative hope in his voice that suggested he felt the same connection she did. "I would like that very much," she said, smiling up at him. "You can find me at the schoolhouse most days, or I board at Mrs. Patterson's house on 3rd Street. Wade's answering smile was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. "Then I will see you next week," he said. "Until then, please be careful. Stay in busy areas and do not walk anywhere alone after dark." "I will," she promised. Then, acting on impulse, she reached up and squeezed his hand where it rested on the saddle horn. "Thank you, Wade, for everything." She walked back to her boarding house with her heart feeling lighter than it had in months, barely noticing the curious looks from townspeople who wondered where she had been. Mrs. Patterson scolded her for worrying everyone, but her concern was genuine, and Theresa found herself telling an edited version of the truth about being caught in the storm and finding shelter in a cabin rather than risk the dangerous ride back. The week that followed passed with agonizing slowness. Theresa threw herself into her teaching with renewed energy, finding patience for her students that had sometimes eluded her before. The younger children were learning their letters with enthusiasm, and the older ones were progressing well in their arithmetic and history. She had even started a small lending library using books donated by some of the more established families, and the children's excitement about having access to stories beyond their primers made all her efforts worthwhile. True to Wade's prediction, Sheriff Fletcher came to see her on the second day after her return. The Garrett brothers had apparently left town rather suddenly, and while the sheriff could not prove they had been involved in anything criminal, he made it clear that if they returned and bothered her again, he would personally ensure they spent time in his jail. His matter-of-fact protection made Theresa feel safer, though she could not help but wonder if Wade had something to do with the lawman's timely intervention. When the following Saturday arrived, Theresa found herself checking the window of the schoolhouse every few minutes, her stomach fluttering with nervous anticipation. She had changed her dress 3 times that morning before settling on her best blue wool, the one that brought out the color of her eyes and fit her figure in a way that was respectable but flattering. She told herself she was being silly, that it was just dinner with a man who had helped her, but her racing heart knew better. Wade arrived in the early afternoon, riding Sterling down the main street with the confident ease of a man completely comfortable in the saddle. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance as well, wearing what must have been his best clothes and a hat that looked newer than the one he had worn before. He tied Sterling outside the schoolhouse and came to the door, knocking softly even though she had already seen him and was waiting just inside. "Hello," he said when she opened the door, his eyes lighting up as he took in her appearance. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," Theresa said, feeling her cheeks warm at the sincere admiration in his voice. "You look very handsome yourself." They walked together to the Grand Hotel, Silverton's finest establishment, which boasted a restaurant that served meals on actual china plates rather than tin. It was the sort of place Theresa had never expected to visit on her teacher's salary, and she could not help but be impressed by the white tablecloths and the oil paintings on the walls depicting mountain scenes. Wade pulled out her chair with a courtesy that suggested someone had taught him proper manners, even if he rarely had occasion to use them. Over roasted chicken and potatoes, they picked up their conversation as if no time had passed since that night in the cabin. Wade told her about his week, about checking his trap lines and cutting firewood for the remainder of the winter. Theresa shared stories about her students, laughing as she described the younger one's creative attempts at spelling and the older boy who had actually expressed interest in continuing his education beyond the basics. "You love your work," Wade observed, watching her face as she spoke. "I can hear it in your voice when you talk about the children." "I do," Theresa admitted. "Even when it is frustrating, even when I feel like I am not reaching them, I love it. My father always said that education was the greatest gift you could give someone, the one thing that could never be taken away once it was received. I like to think I am honoring his memory by passing that gift along." Wade reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the gesture so natural that Theresa barely registered it until she felt the warmth of his palm against her skin. "He would be proud of you," he said seriously. "Anyone can see that you are making a real difference here." The simple words, spoken with such conviction, made Theresa's eyes prickle with unexpected tears. She blinked them back, smiling at Wade with a gratitude that went beyond mere words. "That means more to me than you know," she said softly. They lingered over coffee after the meal, neither quite ready to end the afternoon. Wade told her about his family in Wyoming, about letters that took weeks to arrive, and the visits he made every few years to see his parents and brothers. Theresa learned that he was 24, that he had been on his own for 6 years, and that his dream was to eventually expand his small operation into a proper ranch that could support a family. "I know it might not seem like much right now," he said, his eyes serious as they met hers. A cabin in the mountains and a few head of cattle. But I have plans, Theresa. In a few more years, once I have saved enough and built up the herd, it could be something real, something permanent. It already is something real, Theresa said firmly. You have built it with your own hands, through your own hard work. That is more than most people can say. You should be proud of what you have accomplished. The look Wade gave her was full of such warmth and appreciation that Theresa felt her breath catch. Would you like to see it? He asked suddenly. The meadows I told you about where the cattle graze in summer. It is still too much snow to reach them now, but in spring, when the wildflowers bloom, it is like nothing else in the world. Would you come with me then? Let me show you what I am working toward. Yes, Theresa heard herself say without hesitation. I would love to see it. They began courting in earnest after that day, a relationship that grew deeper with each passing week. Wade made the trip to Silverton every Saturday without fail, arriving in the afternoon to take Theresa to dinner or for walks through the town when the weather allowed. On the days when fresh snow made travel difficult, he came anyway, content to sit in Mrs. Patterson's parlor and talk while the landlady served as a mostly discreet chaperone, knitting in the corner and pretending not to eavesdrop on their conversation. Theresa learned that Wade was more educated than she had initially assumed, that his mother had been a school teacher herself before marriage, and had insisted all her sons learn to read and write properly. He could discuss books with surprising insight, and he had a naturalist's knowledge of the mountains and their ecology that rivaled anything in her textbooks. She found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that sometimes frightened her, counting the days between Saturdays and feeling her heart lift every time she caught sight of him riding down the street. The town gossips noticed, of course. Mrs. Patterson reported with barely concealed glee that half of Silverton was speculating about when the schoolteacher and the mountain cowboy would announce their engagement. The married teachers who had previously treated Theresa with polite distance suddenly wanted to be her friend, offering advice about marriage and homemaking that she had not requested. Even her students noticed the change in her, teasing her gently about her improved mood, and the way she sometimes stared out the window with a dreamy expression when she thought no one was looking. Winter slowly gave way to early spring, the snow melting from the streets of Silverton even as it remained thick in the high mountains. Wade's visits became longer, sometimes stretching from afternoon until evening, and Theresa could sense he was building up to something, that there was a question hanging unspoken between them that they were both almost ready to acknowledge. It came on a Saturday in late April, when the aspens were just beginning to leaf out, and the air carried the promise of warmth after so many cold months. Wade had brought Sterling and a gentle mare he had borrowed from a rancher friend, and he took Theresa riding into the foothills where wildflowers were indeed beginning to bloom in scattered patches of color against the remaining snow. They rode for hours, climbing higher into country Theresa had never seen, until Wade finally reined in at a spot overlooking a wide meadow. Even with patches of snow still covering the ground, Theresa could see the beauty Wade had described. The valley spread below them was sheltered by pine-covered ridges, with a clear stream running through its center and grass, already showing green where the sun had melted the winter drifts. She could imagine how it would look in full summer, carpeted with flowers and filled with grazing cattle, and the vision was so lovely it made her throat tight. "This is it," Wade said softly, dismounting and coming to help her down. "This is what I wanted to show you. In a few more weeks, you will not be able to see the ground for all the columbines and Indian paintbrush. The cattle will come up here to graze, and I will spend most of my time in a line cabin on the far side, checking on them and making sure none wander off or fall prey to predators. "It is beautiful," Theresa breathed, unable to take her eyes off the vista before her. "I can see why you love it here." Wade took her hand, his touch gentle but his grip firm as he turned her to face him. His honey-colored eyes were serious, searching her face with an intensity that made her heartbeat quicken. "Theresa," he said, his voice steady despite the nerve she could see in his expression. "I know we have only known each other for a few months. I know that by all rights I should wait longer, court you properly for at least a year before asking what I am about to ask. But I also know my own heart, and I know what I feel when I am with you." Theresa's breath caught as Wade reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small box, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small stone that caught the sunlight. "It is not much," he said quickly. "I know you probably dreamed of something fancier, with a bigger stone or more elaborate setting. But it was my grandmother's ring, and my mother sent it to me when I wrote to tell her I had met someone special. She said if I was sure, if I truly believed I had found the woman I wanted to spend my life with, then I should have the ring to offer her." "Wade," Theresa whispered, her eyes filling with tears that she did not bother to wipe away. "I love you," he said simply. "I love your intelligence and your compassion, the way you care so deeply about your students and your work. I love the way you laugh at my stories, and the way you see beauty in this rough country that some people call God-forsaken. I love how brave you are, how you made a life for yourself here, even though you had every reason to be afraid. I love talking to you and listening to you and just being near you." He took a breath, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I know I cannot offer you much right now. A cabin that is too small and winters that are too long and a life that will be hard more often than it is easy. But I can promise you that I will work every day to build something better, something worthy of you. And I can promise that you will never be alone again, never have to face anything by yourself as long as I am alive to stand beside you." "Yes," Theresa said through her tears, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Wade, I will marry you. I love you too, so much that sometimes it frightens me. You make me feel safe and valued and understood in ways I never thought I would experience. I do not need fancy things or an easy life. I just need you, need this, need us." Wade's face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, the fit surprisingly perfect. Then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her close as if she were something infinitely precious, and Theresa wrapped her arms around his neck and held on just as tightly. When he finally kissed her, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise, a first kiss that felt like the beginning of everything she had been hoping for without quite daring to believe it could happen. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Silverton, with Mrs. Patterson serving as witness and crying happy tears throughout the entire ceremony. Wade wore a new suit purchased especially for the occasion, and Theresa wore a simple white dress that she and her landlady had sewn together in the evenings after school. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Theresa felt a sense of rightness settle over her that made all the hardships of the past few years seem worthwhile. They spent their wedding night in the hotel, where Wade had first taken Theresa to dinner, the proprietor offering them his finest room as a wedding gift. Theresa had been nervous about the intimacy that would follow the ceremony, but Wade was patient and gentle, treating her with such tender care that what she had feared might be awkward became instead beautiful, a physical expression of the love they had declared to each other. They lay awake long into the night, talking and laughing and making plans for their future together, both marveling at how much their lives had changed since that snowy afternoon when 3 men cornered a frightened woman in an alley. Moving to the cabin was an adjustment, though not as difficult as Theresa had feared. She finished out the school year in Silverton, riding into town each morning with Wade and returning to the cabin each evening, learning to cook on the wood stove and manage the household chores that came with living so far from conveniences. Some of her former colleagues expressed pity that she was giving up her teaching position, but Theresa felt no regret. She had loved her work, but she loved Wade more, loved the life they were building together even with all its challenges. That first summer in the high meadow was everything Wade had promised and more. They lived in the line cabin from June through August, watching the cattle and reveling in the beauty of the mountains in full bloom. Theresa brought books and helped Wade improve his already considerable knowledge, while he taught her to ride confidently and recognize the plants and animals that called these mountains home. They worked side by side during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, growing closer with each passing week. In the fall, when they drove the cattle back down to lower pastures, Theresa discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a little fear, aware of how dangerous childbirth could be, especially so far from town and medical help. But Wade was determined that Theresa would have every advantage, and as winter approached, he arranged for them to stay with Mrs. Patterson in town, so Theresa would be near the doctor when her time came. Their daughter was born on a cold January morning, her first cries loud and healthy in the quiet boarding house. Wade held Theresa's hand through the entire ordeal, his face pale but his presence steady. And when the doctor finally placed the tiny bundle in Theresa's arms, the look on Wade's face was one of such pure wonder that it made her cry all over again. They named her Margaret Rose, after both their mothers, and she was everything they could have hoped for. She had Wade's dark hair and Theresa's blue eyes, and from the beginning she had a disposition that was equal parts sweet and stubborn. Wade proved to be a devoted father, waking with Theresa for midnight feedings and spending hours simply holding his daughter and marveling at the tiny perfection of her fingers and toes. Spring brought them back to the cabin, this time as a family of 3. Theresa had worried about managing a baby in such isolated conditions, but she found motherhood came more naturally than she had expected. Margaret thrived in the mountain air, growing strong and healthy, her laughter filling the cabin with joy. Wade built a cradle with his own hands, carving flowers into the headboard with painstaking care, and Theresa would often find him standing beside it in the evenings, simply watching their daughter sleep with an expression of such love it made her heart ache. The years that followed brought both challenges and triumphs. Wade slowly expanded his operation, his herd growing year by year through careful management and long hours of hard work. There were setbacks, including a harsh winter that took several head of cattle and a dry summer that made grazing scarce. But they weathered each difficulty together, their partnership growing stronger through shared adversity. 2 years after Margaret's birth, Theresa gave birth to a son they named William, a sturdy boy with his father's honey-colored eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. Wade was thrilled to have a son, though he was quick to assure Theresa that he loved both his children equally. Margaret took to her role as big sister with enthusiasm, trying to help with the baby in ways that were sometimes more hindrance than help, but always well-intentioned. As the children grew, Theresa found ways to satisfy her love of teaching by educating them herself, starting with simple lessons in letters and numbers, and progressing to more advanced subjects as they got older. Wade often joined these lessons, learning alongside his children with enthusiasm that inspired them to work harder. Their cabin, while still simple, became filled with books and the laughter of children, a home in the truest sense of the word. In the spring, when Margaret turned 6, Wade finally achieved his dream of expanding his operation. He purchased adjoining land from a rancher who was retiring, nearly doubling the grazing area available for his cattle. With the extra income from a good year, he also began building a larger house, a proper 2-story structure with separate bedrooms for the children and a kitchen big enough for Theresa to work comfortably. The new house took most of the summer to complete, with Wade doing much of the work himself and hiring help from town for the more complex carpentry. Theresa watched it rise from foundation to finished walls with a sense of amazement, marveling at how far they had come from that desperate flight through the snow 7 years earlier. The day they moved in was one of celebration, with Margaret and William running through the empty rooms and claiming their spaces with shouts of excitement. That autumn brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Wade's eldest brother, Daniel, who arrived unannounced one afternoon leading a string of horses. He had come, he explained, to see the life Wade had built and to offer his help in managing the expanded operation. The reunion was joyful, with much backslapping and storytelling, and Theresa took immediately to Daniel, who had the same honest manner and kind eyes as his younger brother. Over dinner that night, Daniel made a proposal that would change their lives again. He wanted to join Wade in the ranching business, pooling their resources to create something even larger and more sustainable. He had money saved from years of working for wages, and skills in horse training that would complement Wade's cattle expertise. In exchange for a partnership stake, he would provide capital for further expansion and help manage the day-to-day operations. Wade and Theresa discussed it long into the night after their guest had retired to the barn. It was a big decision, one that would mean sharing the dream Wade had built alone for so many years. But it also meant security, the chance to build something that could support both families and eventually be passed down to their children. In the end, they agreed, trusting in the bond of brotherhood and the shared vision of what they could create together. The partnership proved to be everything they had hoped. With Daniel's help, the operation expanded rapidly over the next few years. They purchased more cattle, improved their breeding stock with bulls brought in from Texas, and began supplying beef to the growing mining operations throughout the region. Daniel married a woman from Silverton named Emma, and they built their own house on the property, close enough for the families to support each other but far enough for privacy. Theresa gave birth to 2 more children in quick succession, daughters named Lucy and Sarah, who completed their family. The house that had seemed so spacious when they moved in now rang with the voices of 4 children, and Theresa's days were full of the work of managing a household and educating her growing brood. She sometimes missed her teaching days in town, but she found satisfaction in the knowledge that she was giving her own children advantages she had once only been able to offer to strangers. Margaret grew into a thoughtful, studious girl who loved books as much as her mother did. William was more like his father, happiest when he was outdoors working with the cattle and horses. Lucy and Sarah were still too young to show their full personalities, but they were both bright and curious, constantly asking questions that kept Theresa on her toes. The ranch, now officially called the Emmett Brothers Cattle Company, became one of the most respected operations in the region. Wade and Daniel developed a reputation for honest dealing and quality stock, and their success inspired other small operators to believe that it was possible to build something lasting in these mountains. They employed several ranch hands year-round and more during the busiest seasons, becoming important contributors to the local economy. On a warm summer evening when Theresa was 31 and Wade 33, they found themselves alone on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains while their children played in the yard under the watchful eye of Emma. It had been 12 years since that snowy day when Wade had grabbed Theresa's hand and pulled her to safety. And as she looked at everything they had built together, Theresa felt a profound sense of gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought them together. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" she asked Wade, leaning into his side as his arm came around her shoulders. "If you had not been in town that day, or if you had not seen what was happening." Wade was quiet for a moment, his hand gently rubbing her arm. "I try not to," he admitted. "The thought of what might have happened to you, of never knowing you or having this life we have built together, it is too terrible to contemplate." He turned to look at her, his honey-colored eyes still capable of making her heart skip after all these years. "But I do think about how lucky I am. How one moment of being in the right place at the right time gave me everything I never knew I was missing." "I am the lucky one," Theresa insisted, reaching up to cup his cheek with her hand. "You saved me in more ways than just pulling me out of that alley. You gave me a home and a family, and a love I never dreamed I could have. You made me believe in happy endings again." Wade turned his head to kiss her palm, a gesture that had become familiar over their years together, but never lost its power to make her feel cherished. "We saved each other," he said firmly. "You gave me purpose beyond just surviving, beyond just building a ranch. You gave me someone to build a life with, someone to share all of this with. Everything I have accomplished, I have done because I wanted to be worthy of you." "You were always worthy," Theresa said softly. "From that very first moment when you could have ridden past but chose instead to help a stranger, you were worthy. Your actions showed me who you were, and I fell in love with that man long before I was ready to admit it to myself." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. In the yard, Margaret was organizing her younger siblings into some elaborate game that involved much running and laughter, while from Daniel and Emma's house came the sound of their new baby crying. It was the sound of life continuing, of family and community and all the things that made existence meaningful. "I love you," Wade said, the words as sincere as they had been the day he proposed on that mountain meadow all those years ago. "Thank you for saying yes, for taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing but a small cabin and big dreams." "I love you too," Theresa replied, turning in his arms to kiss him properly. "And I would say yes again, 1,000 times over. You gave me everything I needed, even when I did not know what I was looking for. You are my home, Wade Emmett, and you always will be." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, and their children's laughter continued to fill the air, Theresa reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The fear and loneliness of those early days in Silverton seemed like ancient history now, someone else's story rather than her own. She had been cornered and afraid, uncertain of her future, and then a cowboy had grabbed her hand and pulled her toward a life more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. They had built something real together, something lasting. Not just the ranch with its growing herds and expanding buildings, but a family rooted in love and respect and partnership. Their children would grow up knowing they were cherished, would have opportunities Theresa and Wade had never enjoyed, would carry forward the values their parents had worked so hard to instill. And through it all, through every challenge and triumph, every joy and sorrow, they would face it together. Just as they had from that first desperate flight through the snow, Wade and Theresa would continue forward hand in hand, building their future one day at a time, their love the foundation upon which everything else rested. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers from the high meadows, and Theresa breathed it in deeply, savoring the perfume of home. This was where she belonged, here in these mountains with this man and these children, living a life that was sometimes hard but always worthwhile. She had found her place in the world at last, had discovered that home was not a location but a person, and that love could transform even the most frightening beginning into the happiest of endings. Margaret called out that it was getting dark, and could they please come inside, and Wade and Theresa rose together, his hand finding hers with the automatic ease of long practice. They walked into their home, into the warmth and light and laughter that awaited them, and Theresa sent up a silent prayer of thanksgiving for the day a cowboy had chosen to be her hero, for every day since that had led them to this moment of perfect contentment. Their story had begun in fear and snow, but it had become something beautiful, a testament to the power of courage and kindness and love to create miracles even in the roughest of settings. And as they closed the door behind them and gathered their family close, Theresa knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single moment of the journey that had brought her home.